Hello, and saddle up as I try and talk very fast to get this into 15 minutes. On the screen here is how I've set up my question. So I've gone for the green style question where I found my own quote from a critic. I got this from, as I say, that post-colonial article that I sent out to you. I've picked that post-colonial article because I think that you probably won't be able to use it. And so I'm just using it as a model here. So my quote is, in Beloved, it is the ex-slaves who insist on telling their experience in slavery, disrupting discourses of history written from the point of view of the critic as white and male. Using ideas from the critical anthology, to what extent do you agree with this in relation to Morrison's novel? Okay, so you're all going to have that second bit probably if you're doing a quote question. Here are the steps that you guys need to go through with your NEA in terms of planning. Step 1, you need to find the debate in the question. Okay, so unpick the wording very carefully and think about how different people might interpret their answer. Then you need to select the lens that's going to help you the most. Then you need to form a line of argument that links to Morrison's purpose, and then you might, well, a plan might emerge, essentially. A structure might emerge where you think, yeah, these are the three things that I'm going to look at. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through how I would do that with this question. So here's my question on the top. Step 1 in the middle, find the debate in the question, unpick the words. So you need to think, what are the key words and how might they be interpreted in conjunction with beloved particularly? What I think about here in terms of defining the key terms of the question will probably later form my introduction, okay? So it's really valuable stuff that you can absolutely recycle and get some word count out of. So for me, there are three parts in here that I think I could debate with beloved, things that I could agree with or disagree with. And the first bit is this idea that it is the ex-slaves who tell their own experience. So in the first box here, I've debated ex-slaves. So I've said, not all of the black narrators are ex-slaves. So we hear from Denver and we hear from Beloved. Now you could say Beloved is an ex-slave, that she, tells us about the Middle Passage and everything like that. But you could also say that Beloved is actually just Seth's daughter, and therefore she's not an ex-slave. She was kind of freed from that. Another thing I might debate about ex-slave is that actually not all of Morrison's narrators are even black. So we experience approaches to 124 and accounts of Seth from white characters like Schoolteacher and Mr. Bodwin. So we have their thoughts as they're kind of approaching that, and we have like an outsider's view of what Seth is like when she commits the murders or when she goes with the axe with Mr. Bodwin. The second bit that I think we could debate from this quote is that they insist on telling their own experience in slavery. I don't know if they do insist on telling it. So some ex-slaves make conscious efforts not to narrate their experience. So Seth likes to disremember. She deliberately forgets things, or she, delays her recognition of Beloved. She doesn't want to face up to that narrative. I could talk about how memory and ghosts are big themes that suggest the past returns to them in ways that they can't actually control. So they're not insisting on telling a story. The past is insisting on being told. And I might talk about Morrison's jazz-like structure and how that creates this unpredictable element of the past. So it's not that they want to tell that story, it's that that story is demanding to be told and they don't seem to have any control over it. I might also talk about how Paul D only finds out about Seth's murder from Stampede. Yeah, there are secrets, there are gaps that the characters absolutely do not want to address. So the idea that they insist on telling their experience, I'm not so sure is true. The final thing that I would want to look at is that it disrupts the white male perspective of history. And I would say, yeah, the structure does definitely disrupt history. It's a disrupted structure. It's not chronological. History is disruptive. It's not playing out kind of, A to Z. I might say that it dedicates itself to slaves, so it's absolutely against the white male voice. It's dedicated to black people. It's mostly narrated by black characters, but also it does use male voices. So the extent to which I agree with this quote, that it gets rid of a male point of view, I don't know if I do agree with that. I think Paul D and Stampede's viewpoints are very important in this novel. It's written by a black woman and it's well received, so it does go some way to readdress that balance of the way that history has been told so far. And it evolves that lineage of black women writers who had to sanitize their accounts of slavery and gives us that more kind of realistic, that very kind of psychological, very violent account that's been missing so far. So it does readdress the balance in some ways. So really zooming in on the words is step 1. Okay, your next step then, step 2, is applying the relevant lens. So I'm looking at all the ideas that you've generated from that quote. What kind of lens seems to jump out at you? Now, from that quote, this idea of disrupting the white male point of view, already I'm immediately thinking feminism. Okay, so I'm looking back through my ideas and thinking, right, which part of this would link to a feminist reading? So I might talk about how there are female and male voices. I might talk about how it's written by a black woman and how it's been really well received actually in her kind of esteem. I might talk about how it's linking back to black women writers and how they've had to have gaps in the past. And now Morrison is finding that she can, speak for the silenced, and how women have traditionally been marginalized and now she's allowing them kind of center stage. Okay. So with feminism, then I'm gathering my ideas at the bottom here, and what I'm doing is thinking about the key terms that I would use from that lens, but also the key quotes from that lens. Okay, so I'm looking back at my anthology and thinking, right, which quotes from the feminist section really link to what I'm talking about. So I think things like phallocentric, which suggests that it's very male-centered, I would say this is not a phallocentric novel. Patriarchal, I think it definitely shows the patriarchy of the time, but it's not a patriarchal novel. And as I've said, marginalized, this idea that, she's bringing a voice to the silenced, she is bringing women, black women, from the margins to the center. This quote is from H. Burton's From Your Anthology, and I thought this was probably relevant. The private and the public cannot be seen as wholly separate. On the contrary, they are intimately linked. Since this is the case, Miller argues, the private sphere is, just like the public realm, thoroughly political. It is a political arena where the same power-based relations exist as in the public world. So I would use that quote to argue that Seth's very personal story, it's all about a family, it's about homemaking, it's about motherhood, is a very political story, and it reflects the public dynamic beyond 124. I would talk about how the outside kind of invades 124. So we have the ghost that invades, and we also have like visiting men. So we have Paul D, we have Stampede, we have those two white men, all of whom get a narrative voice as well. So they are given some kind of power, these outsiders. So I might talk about public versus private and kind of, I suppose, narrative perspective. Another quote that I thought would be useful is from Gilbert and Gubar. So they've talked about how lots of women's novels tend to depict the growth of womanhood as recording a process of anxious self-denial. And I think that's true of this novel, isn't it? So Seth learns to reclaim herself by the end. So she's kind of denied herself the whole way. Beloved grows bigger while she grows smaller, and she denies herself to Beloved. And then she has that repetition of me. And she kind of finds herself again. But what I wanted to kind of debate about that is how Paul D is really instrumental in her reclaiming that. So is that a feminist view if she needs the man to come and get her out of bed when she's kind of given up? But I might also say actually her daughter Denver is really instrumental in that. So I know that a feminist lens is going to help me unpack that quote that I picked for my question. However, more than feminism, the thing that jumped out at me from all my ideas was narrative. Because so much of what I was writing was about perspective and gaps. So if you just look at how many times I've used the word narrators or narrate and gaps, I've used that such a lot. So clearly narrative is going to really help me talk about, does this novel get rid of the white male perspective and does it show slaves insisted on telling their stories? So quotes that I thought would probably be useful here is this one from Morrison where she says, this is a book about things that people don't want to remember. The characters don't want to remember it, I don't want to remember it, the country doesn't want to remember it. Okay, I'll talk about narrative gaps. I would talk about this quote that we've talked about a lot from David Lodge, who talks about that unreliable, omniscient narrator being part of this experimental fiction. And I might say, so right at the end of his quote, he says, the gap between appearance and reality and how to show that human beings distort or conceal reality. This might not be a conscious or mischievous intention on their part. So maybe it's quite a human thing to distort or conceal, I might say. So maybe those gaps are just indicative of the humanity of these characters. So maybe Morrison is using gaps to stress that her characters are human when slavery has tried to deny that for so long. Another thing about narrative that jumped out at me is how often I was talking about the structure. So I was talking about delays. I was talking about how the past keeps returning and this jazz-like structure. And I was talking about gaps. So of course this quote about how the novel is a bit like jazz music I think would be really useful. So Morrison doesn't want us to feel like we know everything. She deliberately kind of leaves us humble. So I suppose, if you are writing from the perspective of a slave, the white man has always presumed to have all the answers, has presumed to know everything about you, like school teacher presumes to know her human and animal qualities. She proves us proves that wrong. She says, you can't know everything about real human people. You'll never know somebody in the way that the white man presumes to know the black slave. Another thing from David Lodge that I thought might be useful for structure is how shift and how that avoids presenting just one thing after another, but actually helps to see links of causality and irony. So I might talk about how Morrison's structure helps her to highlight the cyclical nature of history that haunts the black characters, that explains why Seth takes that axe at the end and history's kind of repeating itself, and how it makes the ending, I suppose, and the focus on tomorrow feel like a release from that cycle. Yeah, finally Seth kind of lets go of the past. So looking at those two sides, I've got much more about narrative. I've got narrative in every box, haven't I, than I have about feminism. So the end of step 2, in terms of like picking my lens, is picking the most fruitful lens and then summarizing what debate there is. Okay, so you pick which lens you want to do, and then you put agree on one side and disagree on the other side. So why would you agree with that quote from a narrative point of view, and why would you disagree with it? So the reasons that I would agree with this quote at the top. Morrison does deliberately evolve the history of black women's writing to include vivid and violent depictions. Okay, so this last bit about how it's going beyond the white male perspective, yes, she's deliberately doing that, I agree. I also agree because she's using lots of black female narrators like Seth, Denver, and Beloved, who would have been silenced by literary and historical accounts. Also, she uses the character of Beloved as this kind of repeating motif, yeah, this idea of repeat. She uses a repetitive jazz-like narrative structure and multiple perspectives to show that these stories insist on being told. So yes, I agree with that insistence that this quote suggests. I also agree that it disrupts discourse. Yeah, I would talk about how David Lodge would find her narrative style very experimental. It disrupts chronology. I would say that she is consciously filling the blanks that the traditional slave narrative left. So when we're talking about, how history is being written by white men, yes, she consciously is filling in those gaps. She's said as much, I would quote her. In terms of why I would disagree with this quote, though, as I've said, the insistence isn't always a conscious choice from these ex-slaves, but seems to be part of like a trauma of reliving of flashbacks. So the repetitive structure and the ghost character suggests that Seth is haunted rather than choosing the narrator experience. She doesn't seem in control when Beloved's suddenly getting massive and she's kind of wasting away. Also, another reason that I would disagree with the quote is that there's many gaps where characters refuse to tell their story. They don't insist on telling it at all. So Seth, for example, she doesn't insist on telling people how she had to murder her own children. She doesn't insist on telling people about what happened to her with school teacher and the nephews. I might talk about how Sixo decides to be mute. He gives up English language, doesn't he? He doesn't want to tell that story anymore. Also, this quote I thought was really useful, how Ella listens for the holes in like what the fugitives tell her, what the fugitives do not say, yeah, the unnamed, the unmentioned. And then finally, how Morrison says that this is a book about things that people don't want to remember. So I know that I can debate this quote that I picked from my question because I can agree with it and I can disagree with it using that narrative lens. So step 3 then is summarizing your argument by focusing on Morrison's purpose. So basically you should try and use all of the key terms that you unpacked in step 1, all the key words of that quote, and try and mold them together in like a kind of thesis statement. So you're distilling your agree and your disagree down to one argument, if you will. And if it's more than one sentence, that's fine because that shows a bit of nuance. So right at the bottom of this slide is what I think I'll probably be arguing in my essay. Ultimately, Morrison, your two important words, wrote Beloved to disrupt the discourse of history written only from the point of view of critic and white male by including multiple narrative voices, mostly black and mostly female. However, while the past must be dealt with in order to move forward, ex-slaves do not always insist on telling their experience of slavery, but sometimes find strength in refusing to speak of it. Morrison does this to highlight their independence and individuality in a way that slavery and historical accounts have often denied. So that's how I would essentially reduce my essay, if you will. That's my argument, isn't it? So, having looked at your thesis statement, you might be able to break it down into what your points are going to be. Everybody's introduction is going to be the same. You're going to define the key terms in the question. You're going to make it clear which lens you're applying and why. You're going to spell out the whole argument. You're going to put basically that big conclusion that you've just written on the past step. Then I've just split my argument into 3 sections. So my first one is all about how, yes, she's disrupting the discourse of white males because she's writing from a black female perspective. Secondly, I'm going to run out of time here, guys. I'm going to pause and I will make the second video